Part 1. The primal call of isolation. What if the most terrifying stories were never meant to be written down, only whispered from one generation to the next, carried on the wind through places where roads end and time seems to hesitate? Because long before cities drowned the world in light and noise, fear learned how to survive in silence. And tonight, before we begin, ask yourself this simple question. When civilization pulls back and leaves only land, darkness, and memory behind, what kind of monsters does the human mind create to explain what it cannot control? Because deep in the forgotten corners of the world, isolation does not just breed loneliness. It gives birth to legends that feel disturbingly alive. And if you're new here, this channel explores true folklore, unsolved horror, and the unsettling stories that history never fully buried. So if you want more deep, atmospheric documentaries like this, take a moment now to subscribe, because the stories we tell only get darker from here. And as we begin, imagine standing at the edge of a rural hollow where cell signals vanish. Houses sit miles apart, and wells still exist not as decoration, but as lifelines. Because in these places, wells are not just holes in the ground. They are mouths, listening, waiting, and remembered for reasons no one fully explains anymore. And in one isolated Appalachian valley, passed over by highways and forgotten by industry, locals speak quietly of something they call the moss-bound watcher, a presence said to rise from bog-fed wells during seasons of heavy fog. Described not as a creature that hunts, but as one that observes standing half-formed in mist, its shape blending bark, moss, and shadow. And what makes the story unsettling is not its appearance, but its rule. Children are warned never to look down into old wells after sunset, because those who do are said to dream of forests swallowing their homes, of roots breaking foundations, and of something breathing patiently below. And whether these stories began as warnings to keep children safe, or as attempts to explain disappearances that never made the news, no one can say, because isolation does something strange to memory. It blurs the line between caution and belief. And in these communities, folklore is not entertainment. It is survival knowledge, disguised as myth, passed down through tone pauses, and the way elders avoid certain places after dark and across continents. This pattern repeats itself, because when people live close to land and far from help, fear becomes localized, shaped by forests, mountains, wells, and weather. And the monsters that emerge are not random. They are reflections of the land itself, patient, ancient, and deeply rooted. And as we move deeper into these forgotten landscapes, the whispers grow clearer, not louder, because true folkloric horror does not scream, it waits. PART, two guardians, warnings, and monsters of the old ways in remote corners of the world, where winters lasts longer than memory and survival depends on respecting land that can kill without malice. Folklore does not always paint monsters as purely evil, and nowhere is this clearer than in isolated Nordic farming settlements, where stories of beings like the Huldra or the Nis persist. Entities described not as invaders, but as ancient custodians bound to soil, water, and tradition. And what makes these legends unsettling is their conditional morality. Because villagers are taught that these beings protect those who honor the old ways and punish those who take more than they need. And in one such village, tucked between fjords and forests, elders still warn that abandoned wells and springs must be left offerings during the winter solstice, because the water remembers who respects it, and those who mock these rituals are said to experience livestock refusing to drink, tools vanishing overnight, and an overwhelming sense of being watched from just beyond the tree line. And while modern minds may dismiss this as superstition, these stories functioned as law long before written rules existed, reinforcing balance, restraint, and humility in environments where arrogance meant death. And this same pattern appears again in isolated regions of Eastern Europe, where forest spirits tied to old wells are believed to punish greed, not through violence, but through disorientation, causing travelers to walk in circles, hear familiar voices calling their names, or feel compelled to follow paths that lead nowhere. And what connects all these legends is not fear alone, but instruction, because folkloric horror teaches through unease, shaping behavior subtly over time. And as centuries pass, the original reasons fade, but the fear remains, preserved in story form. And even today, locals may not believe in the creature, but they still avoid the place, still lower their voices, still refuse to draw water after dark. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect is that these legends adapt, absorbing modern anxieties, because in abandoned rural industrial towns, new horrors emerge, like the so-called Rust Walker, a figure whispered about in post-mining communities, where wells draw contaminated water and factories rot into the ground. Described as something tall and slow that moves between derelict buildings at night. Its presence marked not by sound, but by the sudden failure of lights and the metallic taste in the air. And these modern folkloric entities reflect ecological neglect, abandonment, and the fear of being left behind by progress, proving that folklore does not die. It evolves, and as long as isolation exists, so will the monsters that explain it. By now, it becomes clear that folkloric horror is not about whether these entities exist in a literal sense, but about why they persist so stubbornly in places where isolation still shapes daily life, because wells, forests, hollows, and abandoned towns serve as psychological thresholds, places where visibility ends and imagination begins. And the whispering wells that appear across cultures are symbols of depth, memory, and vulnerability, reminding us that beneath every settlement lies something older, something unseen, and something that does not need to move to be feared. And when people disappear in these regions, when livestock avoids water, when radios pick up voices that don't match any frequency, folklore steps in not to answer questions, but to give fear a shape that can be spoken aloud. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is that these stories often fade, not because they are disproven, but because the communities that carried them vanish, leaving behind only fragments, abandoned homes, and wells no one dares to fill in. And as viewers, it's tempting to see these legends as distant. But every place has its forgotten corners, its quiet warnings, its stories no longer told loudly. And before we end, ask yourself this: what legends existed where you live before streetlights, before internet, before explanations were easy. Because true horror does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates slowly, whispered across generations until it feels inevitable. And if you've ever heard a story that locals refuse to repeat clearly, or a place everyone avoids without reason, share it in the comments. Because these stories survive only when they are remembered. And if you want more long-form, atmospheric horror rooted in real folklore and forgotten histories, subscribe and stay with us. Because there are still wells whispering in the dark, and not all of them want to be found.